The gavel struck hard against the oak desk, though there was no courtroom here, only the parlor of the Whitmore house, curtains drawn tight against prying eyes. The sound made Clara flinch all the same. Her father stood tall, rigid, his frame outlined by the oil lamp's glow. Judge Whitmore had built his entire life on order, on rules and reputation that brooked no softness, no slip of scandal. And now his daughter sat before him, hands folded tightly over her lap, eyes lowered to hide the truth she could no longer deny. "You've brought shame into this house," he said, his voice a low thunder. "Shame to my name, to this town, to everything I've built." Clara swallowed hard. She was only 19, with round cheeks and wide brown eyes that still carried a trace of girlhood, though her body told a different story now. The curve of her middle betrayed her secret to anyone willing to look. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but the words tangled like barbed wire in her throat. Her father paced once, twice, the sound of his boots heavy across the rug. "You will not remain under my roof, flaunting your disgrace. You think I'll let the church whisper behind their hymnals? That I'll give the gossips the satisfaction of pointing their fingers at me?" His jaw tightened, lips pressed thin. "No, Clara. If you wanted kindness, you should have thought of that before you opened your door to ruin." The word cut deep. She flinched, but held still. "I will see you married," Judge Whitmore declared. "By week's end, you'll be bound to a man who'll take you where no one has to see your shame. The mountains." Clara's head snapped up. "Married?" Her voice cracked, a tremor of fear. He didn't hesitate. "Jonas Hale, trapper, hermit, half a savage, if you ask the church. He lives where even wolves think twice before treading. He wants supplies. I want my name untarnished. You'll go." The silence that followed was heavy as stone. Clara's heart pounded against her ribs, each beat a protest she dared not voice. Jonas Hale. She knew the name. Everyone did. The man who came down from the Bitterroots twice a year with pelts strapped to his mule, who spoke to no one, who looked like a figure carved from the mountain itself. Men muttered stories about him in saloons. Some said he'd killed 3 soldiers in the war. Others claimed his first wife had died at his hands. No one knew the truth, only that he was not a man to invite into polite company. And now he was to be her husband. By Sunday, the church pews were thick with whispers. The preacher's words of union sounded brittle, as if they might crack in his mouth. Clara stood in a plain cotton dress that fit too tightly across her middle, her hair braided in a style that made her look younger than she felt. No flowers adorned her hands, only the slight tremble she tried to still. Behind her, townsfolk leaned close to murmur. Some pitied, most smirked. The papers were signed quickly. Judge Whitmore did not stay to watch. By noon, Clara was led outside where a mule-drawn wagon waited. Jonas Hale stood beside it, broad-shouldered, scarred, his hair long beneath a battered hat. He didn't reach for her. He didn't even greet her. He only took the reins, glanced once at the trunk Judge Whitmore's men had loaded, and started up the road without a word. Clara climbed onto the wagon seat, spine stiff against the wooden slats, her eyes fixed on the valley as it fell away behind her. The town, the house she had grown up in, the church where she'd once sung hymns, all of it shrank into dust and distance. She heard the whispers echo long after they faded, ruined, cast off, punishment. But as the wheels creaked higher into the mountains and the shadows of pines closed around them, Clara pressed her hands over her stomach and drew in a slow breath. The cold air stung, but it also cleared. Whatever lay ahead, whether cruel or kind, it would no longer be her father's judgment that shaped her life. She did not look back. The wind in the Bitterroot Mountains had a way of cutting through a man, of stripping him down to bone and memory. Jonas Hale had lived with it for more than a decade, and if the weather hadn't killed him, neither had the war, nor the winter that followed, nor the silence that pressed in after he buried the only woman who had ever shared his cabin. At 38, Jonas was a man of scars, some visible across his cheek and shoulder, where blades and bullets had found him, others buried so deep in his chest that only the long nights and the whiskey remembered them. His cabin clung to a clearing on the ridge, a squat structure of weathered logs and a stone chimney that smoked year-round. The roof sagged a little on the east side. The shutters rattled when the storms came down from the peaks, but it stood, as stubborn as the man who built it. Jonas had no company save for the hounds he kept for tracking, the traps scattered through the timber, and the mule that carried his loads down to the valley twice a year. The valley folk whispered about him, of course. They said he had killed men in Missouri during the war, not in fair battle, but in cold blood. They said he had broken a deputy's jaw with a single punch and left him lying in the mud. They said his wife had died at his hands, though the truth was she had slipped away in childbirth, blood on her lips and a cry that never finished. Jonas never corrected the rumors. He preferred them. Fear kept the curious away. So when Judge Whitmore rode up his ridge with 2 wagons, one loaded with supplies, another with livestock, Jonas had known the man wanted something too costly to speak plainly. The judge's jaw was clenched, his tone curt, as if the very ride offended him, and then he'd said it, quick and sharp, as though the words might rot if left too long in the air. "My daughter, she's yours now." Jonas had stared at him, the scar on his cheek pulling tight as his teeth ground together. He wanted no wife. He wanted no daughter of a judge, spoiled and soft, staring at him with horror every time he moved. But the judge had pressed on, voice clipped. "You'll take her, and you'll keep her out of sight. In exchange, you'll have these supplies more than you'd gather in a year, and my word, the law won't trouble you, no matter what stories folks whisper." Jonas had almost told him no, almost sent him and his wagons back down the ridge with nothing but the echo of his refusal. But then he looked at the girl, Clara, round-faced, cheeks flushed from cold and shame, her eyes cast low like she was bracing for a blow. She didn't look spoiled, she looked ruined. And Jonas knew what it was to be ruined. When the judge left her standing there with nothing but a trunk and a bundle of dried flowers clutched in her hand, Jonas said nothing. He didn't touch her. He didn't even look too long. He only lifted the trunk into the wagon bed and motioned toward the seat. She climbed up without a word, trembling so hard he thought she might shake herself apart. The mule started forward. Snow whispered through the trees. For a long time, the only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the ragged edge of her breath. Jonas kept his eyes on the trail, his hands steady on the reins. He wanted her to know nothing would be asked of her here, not her body, not her words. He didn't want her, but he also didn't intend to break her. When the cabin came into sight, she let out the faintest breath, a sound caught somewhere between fear and relief. Jonas glanced at her then, just once. She expected cruelty. He gave her silence. Not kindness, not yet, but something close enough to keep the world from swallowing her whole. The cabin crouched low against the trees, its logs dark with age and weather, smoke curling faintly from the chimney, as if to prove life still clung to it. Clara sat stiffly on the wagon seat, her gloved hands knotted in her lap, staring at the small structure that was to be her new home. 1 room. No porch, no shutters painted bright, no curtains in the window. Just timber and stone, built for survival, not comfort. She could already feel the cold seeping out of the cracks in the walls, could already imagine the long nights where the silence pressed too tight. Jonas climbed down first, his boots crunching in the snow-packed dirt. He didn't look at her, just untied the mule and led it to the lean-to beside the cabin where feed and water waited. Clara sat frozen a moment longer, heart rattling against her ribs. Her father's words still burned in her ears. "You'll see what it is to be punished." She had braced herself for cruelty, for a man's rough hand, for laughter like knives. But Jonas Hale said nothing. When he came back, he took her trunk from the wagon and carried it inside without asking. Clara followed hesitantly, her boots catching on the uneven ground. The door creaked when she pushed it open, and the smell of smoke and pine pitch filled her nose. The cabin was darker than she expected, lit only by the glow from a low fire in the stone hearth. 1 room, just as she'd feared. A bed in the corner, its quilt patched and worn. A table with two chairs, one leg braced with a wedge of wood. Hooks on the wall for coats. A shelf of chipped plates. A row of jars filled with dried beans and strips of meat. No lace. No softness. Not a thing in the place suggested a woman had ever belonged here. Jonas set her trunk down against the far wall. He gestured with a tilt of his head. "That corner's yours, you can sleep there." Clara blinked. She followed his gesture and saw a small cot folded against the wall, a wool blanket laid across it. Separate from his bed, she felt her throat tighten, unsure if it was relief or dread. "All right," she whispered. Her voice sounded small in the quiet. Jonas didn't respond. He crouched by the fire, stirred the pot that simmered over the coals, and ladled stew into a tin bowl. He set it on the table without ceremony. "Eat. It'll be cold soon." Clara didn't move at first. She watched him warily, waiting for the sharp edge, the sneer, the hand that would remind her she was here not by choice, but by shame. None came. He poured himself a bowl, sat opposite her, and ate in silence. She picked up the spoon slowly, tasting the stew. It was plain, heavy with potatoes and bits of venison, but hot and filling. When the meal was done, Jonas rose and pointed toward the back door. "Water pails there, creaks down the path if it runs low." That was all. No questions, no demands. He cleared the bowls and set them in the wash basin, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to share a table with a stranger who carried his name now. Clara sat a long while on the cot after that, listening to the crackle of the fire, her fingers curled tight in her lap. She had been braced for violence, for punishment carved in flesh. Instead, she found herself in a silence that was neither cruel nor kind, only steady. Jonas Hale barely looked at her, spoke only when needed, but the space he gave her was more than she had expected. As the firelight flickered across the rough-hewn walls, Clara wondered if her father had been wrong. Perhaps this marriage, this exile, was not the punishment he had meant it to be. Perhaps it was something else, something she did not yet understand. The days slid past like the snow melt down the mountain, slow and steady, marked by the rhythm of work and silence. Jonas rose before dawn each morning, pulling on his boots without a word, the scrape of leather against wood the only sound in the dark cabin. He left with his traps slung over his shoulder, rifle across his back, and returned hours later with pelts draped over the mule, his beard frosted with cold. If he was tired, he didn't say it. If the mountain wore on him, Clara never heard. He moved like a man accustomed to carrying weight without complaint. Clara kept to herself. She swept the cabin, mended seams on his shirts, cooked what she could from the jars on the shelves. Her movements had grown slower, her middle pressing gently against the fabric of her dress. She felt it in her back when she bent to lift the kettle, in her ankles when she stood too long at the fire. Every shift of her body was a reminder of the child that had brought her here, the reason she had been cast out of her father's house and bound to a stranger. She expected Jonas to notice, to comment, to sneer about her shame or spit the word her father had branded her with. Ruined. But Jonas said nothing. He watched sometimes, his eyes tracking her as she moved about the room, but his gaze was steady, not cruel. When she caught him looking, he turned away without explanation, leaving her uncertain if it was disapproval or something else. In the evenings, after the work was done and the stew bowls washed clean, Jonas sat by the fire with a piece of wood in his hands. He carried a knife, sharp and sure, and the sound of it scraping against pine or cedar filled the room like a quiet song. Shavings curled to the floor while his rough hands coaxed shape from the block. He never spoke during those hours, never offered the piece to her or explained what he was making. Sometimes she thought it was a habit meant only to keep his hands busy, to keep the silence from swallowing them whole. Clara lay on the cot in the far corner, staring at the rafters as the knife worked its rhythm. She listened to the fire crackle, to the dogs sighing in their sleep outside the door, to the steady sound of Jonas breathing as he whittled. It should have unnerved her, the quiet. Instead, it became something else, a strange kind of lullaby, rough-edged but steady. One night, the cold bit deeper than usual, a sharp wind slipping through the cracks in the logs. Clara curled into herself on the cot, pulling the thin blanket close, her body aching from the weight she carried. Sleep came fitfully, broken by shivers. When she woke just before dawn, the fire burned low, and Jonas was nowhere in sight. But at the edge of her cot lay another blanket, folded neat and square, thicker than hers, smelling faintly of pine smoke. She stared at it for a long moment before pulling it over her shoulders. The warmth seeped into her bones, and with it came a confusion she couldn't shake. She had braced herself for cruelty, for harsh words, or a hand raised in anger. Instead, she received silence, space, and a folded blanket. It wasn't kindness, not in the way she had once dreamed of as a girl, but it was something steady, something solid. And in the quiet hours before the sun crested the ridge, Clara began to wonder if the punishment her father had promised wasn't what she had been given at all. The creek ran swift and cruel that morning, its water biting at Clara's wrists as if to punish her further. She knelt at the bank, skirts bunched high, a pile of Jonas's shirts heavy with soap in her lap. Her fingers ached from the cold, raw red where the icy current lapped over them, but she kept scrubbing, harder and harder, as if she could wash away the weight that had clung to her since the day her father turned his face from her. The air was sharp with frost, her breath pluming like smoke, and each strike of cloth against rock echoed her own ragged thoughts. Her back throbbed from bending too long, her ankles swelling where the boots pinched. The child inside her shifted, a small flutter beneath her ribs that sent a wave of panic rolling up her throat. She froze, hands dripping, staring down at the half-clean shirt clutched in her fingers. Fear surged so suddenly it stole her breath. What if she wasn't strong enough? What if the child came too early, too small, and she alone with nothing but wilderness to help her? What if Jonas saw her the way her father did, nothing more than a mistake carried in her belly? The sob broke out before she could stop it. She pressed her hands to her face, wet cloth and all, the chill of it shocking against her cheeks. The dam cracked, and the tears came hard, spilling faster than she could swallow them down. She bent forward over the rocks, her shoulders shaking, her voice muffled in her palms. For weeks she had held herself steady, folding linens, cooking stew, pretending the silence was enough. But the truth pressed out of her in gasps and sobs, loneliness so deep it felt like drowning, shame that clung heavier than wet wool, fear for the life she carried that no one had promised to want. Bootsteps crunched over the frost behind her. Clara froze, mortified, swiping her sleeves across her face. She tried to straighten, to gather the shirts, to hide her weakness before Jonas could see. But her body betrayed her knees buckling as she rose. Arms caught her before she fell, rough and steady. Jonas's coat smelled of smoke and pine as he lifted her against his chest, the weight of her nothing against his strength. He didn't speak, didn't scold, didn't ask why she wept. He simply carried her, striding back toward the cabin while the shirts lay abandoned by the creek. Clara pressed her face into his coat, shamed by her own tears, but too spent to resist. Inside, the fire was still smoldering from the morning. Jonas lowered her gently onto the cot, tugged the blanket over her shoulders, and crouched by the hearth to stir the embers back to life. He moved with the same steady rhythm he always had, as though carrying her had been no more trouble than splitting wood. Clara lay silent, listening to the scrape of the poker, the low crackle of flame catching again. That night, Jonas cooked. He set a bowl before her at the table, stew thicker than usual, with chunks of meat and carrot, and sat across from her with his own. Clara stared at it, throat tight, unable to lift her spoon. He cleared his throat once, the sound low and awkward in the quiet. "You're not a punishment to me." The words were plain, spoken like any other truth, but they hit her with the force of a hammer. Clara's head snapped up, her eyes wide, searching his face for mockery. There was none. His gaze was steady, his scar catching the firelight, his hands wrapped loosely around the bowl. For the first time since she had left her father's house, Clara felt something shift inside her chest. Not relief, not yet. But the faintest crack in the wall she had built, a thin thread of light where she thought there would only be shadow. She gripped the spoon with trembling fingers and began to eat, her tears falling silent into the stew. The first snow came earlier than either of them expected. By mid-October, the drifts were already waist-deep in the clearings, and the wind barreled down from the ridges with a bite that chewed at bone. The cabin walls creaked under the weight of it, logs groaning as if the mountain itself wanted to squeeze them out. Jonas spent his mornings tightening shutters, stacking wood higher against the cabin wall, and checking his traps before the snow buried them. Each night he came home with shoulders heavy and beard iced, setting pelts to dry by the fire while the dogs curled up close to the hearth. Clara watched him work, the way his movements were purposeful, steady, and unflinching against the weather. But the silence pressed harder when the storms came, each howl of wind reminding her she was a stranger in a place built by his hands alone. She couldn't bear the thought of sitting idle while he fought for their survival. The child growing inside her already slowed her steps, but not her will. One morning, while Jonas was lacing his boots, she stood by the door, shawl wrapped tightly across her shoulders. "I'm coming," she said simply. Jonas looked up, brows pulling together. "You'll freeze." "I won't," she answered. And though her voice shook, her chin did not. "I won't be a burden." For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a quiet grunt, he opened the door. The cold slammed into them like a wall. Out in the snow, Jonas showed her how to bend willow branches to fashion a simple snare, how to mask the scent of her hands with dirt before touching the wire. His voice was low, his instructions clipped, but his patience was steady. Clara fumbled at first, her fingers stiff with cold, the wire slipping loose, the knot refusing to hold. He crouched beside her, his large hands guiding hers until the loop held firm. "That'll do," he murmured. She caught the faintest note of approval in his tone, quiet but real, and it warmed her more than the scarf at her neck. The days fell into rhythm. Jonas hunted larger game with his rifle, trudging through the timber for hours, while Clara gathered what she could closer to the cabin kindling, berries when she found them, herbs that clung stubborn against the frost. She learned to mend the small tears in pelts, to stretch hides taut on the frame the way Jonas showed her, pulling them tight until the skin would dry smooth and strong. At night, while he sharpened his knife, she sewed patches into his coat with the furs they'd saved, her stitches clumsy at first, then surer. He began to speak more, not much, but enough to fill the quiet with something other than the howl of the wind, a nod when her snares caught a rabbit, a single word of praise when the firewood she stacked burned steady. Once, when she stumbled in the snow, he caught her elbow and steadied her without hesitation, his hand lingering just a moment too long before letting go. The cabin, once divided into his space and hers, slowly blurred at the edges. She found herself sitting nearer to the fire when he whittled, sometimes daring to ask what shape the wood would take. He answered with a shrug, but she caught the corner of his mouth twitching when she guessed wrong. She began humming softly while she worked, half to soothe herself, half to fill the silence. Jonas never asked her to stop. The distance between them narrowed not with sudden words or grand gestures, but with the small, steady rhythm of survival. 2 bowls set side by side on the table each night, 2 sets of boots drying by the door, 2 shadows cast long against the wall when the fire burned low. Clara lay in her cot one evening, listening to the wind batter the shutters, and realized her fear of being nothing but a punishment was no longer the loudest voice in her chest. It had been replaced by something quieter, something steady, like the crunch of Jonas's boots returning from the hunt or the sound of his breath as he slept on the other side of the room. She closed her eyes, hand resting on the swell of her belly, and for the first time since she had arrived, she felt not cast out, but tethered to the mountain, to the cabin, and perhaps, in some fragile way, to the man who shared it with her. The storm came down from the ridge without warning, swallowing the mountains in a wall of white. Snow hammered against the shutters, piling high against the cabin door, the wind howling so loud it drowned out the crackle of the fire. Jonas had seen storms like it before, the kind that sealed a man inside for days, but this time there was no space for waiting it out. Clara's cry cut through the blizzard, sharp and raw, and Jonas knew the child wasn't waiting. Clara gripped the edge of the table, her face pale, sweat breaking across her brow despite the cold. Her body bent with the force of the pain, her dress damp, her breaths coming in sharp, frightened bursts. Jonas had seen men gutted in battle, had pulled bullets from his own flesh with a hunting knife, but none of that left him as shaken as the sight of her trembling before him. "I can't," she gasped, collapsing against the chair. "You can," Jonas said firmly, kneeling beside her, steadying her shoulders. His voice was low, unyielding, the same tone he used to quiet, skittish horses. "You can, Clara, you will." He cleared the table in a rush, pushing aside the tin bowls and folded cloth, laying down the cleanest sheet they had. The storm battered the roof as he helped her onto it, his hands surprisingly gentle as he braced her back and guided her down. She clutched his arm with surprising strength, nails digging through his sleeve as the next wave of pain seized her. Hours blurred together in firelight and snow. Jonas fetched water, warmed cloths by the hearth, held her hand when she thought she'd break in too. He murmured steady words, though he hardly knew what he was saying, just sounds to anchor her through the agony. Her cries filled the cabin, and with each one, Jonas felt something inside him twist tighter, as though her pain were lashing him too. At last, when her strength was nearly gone, and her breaths came ragged, the child slipped into the world with a cry louder than the storm. Jonas caught the tiny, slick body in his scarred hands, his chest heaving as if he'd just fought his way through battle. For a moment, he just stared, stunned, at the small life wriggling in his grip. Then instinct guided him. He tied off the cord with a strip of cloth, cut it clean, and wrapped the child in the blanket Clara had stitched weeks before. Clara fell back against the sheet, her face wet with tears and sweat, eyes fluttering open. "Is she?" Jonas turned, his hands trembling as he lowered the bundle into Clara's arms. The baby's cries softened as she nestled against her mother, tiny fists clenching. Clara looked down, a sob breaking loose, and then she smiled, weak but radiant. "She's here," she whispered. "She's mine." Jonas hovered awkwardly, his chest tight, his breath uneven. Clara looked up at him, her eyes shining. "Yours too," she said softly. "If you want." For a long moment, Jonas didn't move. Then Clara reached out, pressing the child into his arms. He froze, staring down at the swaddled bundle. The baby squirmed, let out a small sigh, and pressed her face against his chest. Jonas's hands, calloused and scarred from years of war and wilderness, shook as he cradled her, terrified he might break something so small. She's so light," he muttered, his voice rough with awe. Clara smiled through her exhaustion. "Her name is Hope." Jonas looked down at the tiny girl, her dark lashes brushing her cheeks, and felt something fracture inside him. He had carried rifles and traps, pelts and burdens heavier than he cared to count, but never had anything weighed more than this fragile life in his arms. For the first time in years, his eyes burned hot. Hope. He held her tighter, as though daring the storm, the mountains, the world itself to try and take her from him. The snow had melted into thick mud along the creek bed, leaving the ground soft and heavy beneath Jonas's boots. He had gone out early to check the snares, the quiet of the forest broken only by the distant call of a raven. When he returned, the dogs were barking sharp, wild warnings that made his gut twist. From the ridge he saw them 3 men on horseback, their shapes dark against the pale sky, riding straight for the cabin. By the time Jonas reached the clearing, Clara was already at the door. Hope clutched to her chest, her face pale as bone. The men had dismounted and stood in a crooked line by the woodpile, grins sharp as knives, eyes glittering with malice. Their coats were ragged, their boots caked with town mud, and the stink of whiskey drifted even from where Jonas stood. Well, well, the tallest of them called, tipping his hat with a mock bow. If it ain't the mountain ghost himself. Heard you been keepin' company, Hale. Pretty little bird your judge father threw out. Thought we'd come fetch her back. Oh. Clara stiffened, clutching Hope tighter, the baby squirming at the sudden tension. Jonas moved slowly, placing himself between them and the cabin. His rifle was slung across his back, but he didn't reach for it. Not yet. She's not yours to fetch, he said evenly. His voice carried like a low growl, steady as stone. The shorter man spat in the dirt, his laugh sharp. Not ours, true enough. Belongs back in town, though. Folks been talkin'. Say she's ruined. Say no man should keep a whore tucked away like treasure. His grin widened. We're just here to return her proper. Clara's breath caught. Jonas felt the heat rise in his chest, a slow, dangerous burn. He stepped forward once, his boots sinking deep into the mud. One more word out of you, and I'll see if you bleed faster than the hogs I butcher. The leader smirked, unbothered. Easy, Hale, we don't mean no harm. But his hand twitched toward his belt, and that was all it took. Jonas moved faster than the men expected. His rifle came off his back in a single swing, the barrel leveled before the smirk even faded. The dogs lunged, growling low and feral, teeth bared. Jonas's scarred face twisted with fury, and his voice roared over the clearing like thunder. You think you'll take her from me? From my house? I'll drop every last one of you in the snow and feed you to the crows. The laughter drained from their faces. The man with the twitching hand froze, eyes wide as the muzzle stared him down. Jonas didn't waver. His arms were steady, his stance planted deep, the kind of stance that told them he'd fired on men before and wouldn't lose a night's sleep doing it again. Behind him, Clara stood in the doorway, Hope's small cries muffled against her shoulder. She saw Jonas then not as the silent, brooding figure who split wood and carried snares, but as something else entirely wrath harnessed in flesh, a storm bound in scar and bone. For the first time she understood why the valley spoke his name in hushed voices. The leader raised both hands, palms out. Easy now, we ain't looking for a fight. Then get off my land, Jonas barked. His voice cracked through the air like a whip. The men backed away, step by step, until they reached their horses. But the leader paused before mounting, his eyes narrowing. This ain't over. A man can't hide forever up here. We'll be back. Jonas lowered the rifle only once their shapes disappeared into the trees, the dogs pacing restless at his side. His chest rose and fell heavy, but his eyes burned with the kind of fire Clara knew wouldn't be easily put out. She clutched Hope close, her heart pounding. Jonas turned then, his gaze softening just enough to find hers. For a moment, no words were needed. He had stood between her and the world that called her ruined. He had unleashed a fury no man dared challenge. But the echo of the drifter's threat lingered in the clearing long after they were gone, heavy as the clouds gathering over the ridge. The fire burned low that night, the logs snapping in sharp cracks as if the storm outside had followed them indoors. Clara sat close to the hearth, Hope bundled in her arms, her eyes fixed on the flames, though her thoughts were far from the cabin. Every gust of wind against the shutters made her flinch. Every creak of the logs reminded her of the men who had stood outside only hours earlier, their laughter still echoing like a sickness in her chest. But louder still was the memory of Jonas, his voice roaring, his rifle steady, the fury in him so raw it had silenced them. She had never seen a man stand like that. Not for her, not for anyone. Jonas sat at the table, sharpening his knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The rasp of metal against stone filled the silence between them. His shoulders were broad in the firelight, his face half-shadowed, the scar on his cheek drawn hard. Clara watched him, her chest tight with questions she could no longer swallow. Finally, she spoke. Why? The sound of her voice startled her own ears. Jonas didn't look up. Why what? Her fingers tightened around Hope, the baby's breath soft against her neck. "Why did you defend me today? Why haven't you treated me the way my father said you would?" The knife stilled in his hands. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire and Hope's tiny sighs. Jonas set the blade down and leaned back in his chair, his eyes finding hers. The weight of his gaze was heavy, but not cruel. "Because I'm not your father," he said at last. Clara's breath hitched. "Then what are you?" He rubbed a hand across his jaw, the motion weary, as though dragging words from a place he had buried deep. "I was a soldier once, long time ago. Thought I was fightin' for something bigger than myself. Came back with blood on my hands, and nothing in my chest but hollow." His voice was low, almost a growl, but beneath it was something broken. "Took a wife after. She was kind, too kind for me. She carried my child, and when the time came—" His throat tightened, and he looked away toward the fire. Neither of them lived through it. Clara's heart twisted. She had not expected tenderness from him, only hardness, but the words carved something deeper than she could have imagined. "I made a vow," Jonas went on, voice rough. "Never again. No wife, no child, no one to bury in this ground. Better to live alone than watch it all rot in your hands." He shook his head, the scar on his face catching the firelight. "Then your father brought you here. I figured you'd last a week, maybe two, but you stayed. And when those men came—" He broke off, pressing his hand flat on the table. "I couldn't let them take you. Couldn't let them put their filth on you." Clara's eyes blurred with tears. She shifted Hope against her shoulder and rose slowly, crossing the room until she stood near him. Jonas looked up, his face guarded, braced for something he couldn't name. "You don't even see it, do you?" she whispered. His brow furrowed. "See what?" "That you treat me like no one else ever has." Her voice was steady, soft but unyielding, the truth laid bare between them. "Not as a burden, not as shame. You gave me space, you gave me quiet. You gave me more than my own blood ever did." Jonas swallowed hard, his hands tightening on the edge of the table. For a long time he didn't speak, the silence between them louder than the storm outside. Finally, his voice came low, hoarse. "I don't know how to be what you need." Clara reached out, laying her hand over his scarred one. "You already are." For the first time since she had stepped foot in his cabin, Jonas let the silence rest not as distance, but as something shared, fragile, and alive. The fire burned low, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin the world felt still. Spring came to the mountains like a slow breath after a long silence. The drifts melted into rivulets that cut down through the ridges, the trees budding tender green against the gray skeleton of winter. For Clara, each morning was a reminder that she had endured, that the child in her arms was not only alive but thriving, cheeks pink, eyes wide, a soft coo breaking the cabin's once empty quiet. Hope's laughter carried farther than the sound of Jonas's axe, sweeter than the creek's thaw. But word traveled, as it always did. Hunters carried tales down into the valley, and the valley carried them to town. Soon enough, Judge Whitmore heard the stories he never wanted told. His daughter had not only survived the exile but built a life in the mountains, mother to a child no longer hidden in shame. The rumors stirred him like a thorn buried too long under skin. And so, one bright morning when the meadow grass was just beginning to sway with wildflowers, the sound of hooves broke across the clearing. Clara was bent over the washboard, sleeves rolled to her elbows, Hope swaddled in a basket nearby. The moment she heard the horses, her body stiffened. She looked up to see her father's figure riding hard through the gap in the trees, his coat clean, his posture rigid with fury. Behind him trailed two men from town, faces shadowed with curiosity and disdain. The judge dismounted sharply, boots striking the earth like a gavel. His eyes swept over the cabin, the chickens, the stack of wood neatly piled by the wall, then landed on Clara. For a heartbeat, his gaze flickered to the basket at her feet and the child cooing within it. his face twisted, as if the sight of Hope's tiny fists insulted him. "You will come with me," he said, voice clipped as ever, as though no time had passed. "Pack your things. This farce ends now." Clara straightened slowly, her hands trembling, but she did not step back. The judge's tone was one she had obeyed all her life, but she was not the same girl who had left his house in disgrace. She wiped her wet hands on her skirt and lifted her chin. "No." The word was quiet but firm. The judge blinked, unaccustomed to defiance. "You've been deceived," he snapped. "This man, this hermit, he's made a mockery of you. You belong with your family." Clara's throat tightened, but her voice did not falter. "This is my family." She reached down, lifted Hope into her arms, and held her close. "This cabin is my home. Jonas is my partner. And this child is my future." Jonas stepped out then from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his rifle slung casually over one shoulder. He didn't speak, didn't need to. He came to stand beside Clara, broad and solid as the mountain itself, his presence alone a statement. Judge Whitmore's face reddened. "You would choose this life? This exile?" Clara met his gaze, her voice steady as steel. "I didn't survive exile. I found freedom." The silence that followed cut sharper than any shout. The judge's jaw worked as if searching for words, but none came. His hands clenched into fists, his eyes burning with wounded pride. Without another word, he turned on his heel, mounted his horse, and yanked the reins hard. The two men followed, though one looked back once, his expression unreadable. Clara watched them vanish down the trail until the sound of hooves faded into nothing. Her knees threatened to give, but Jonas's steady hand brushed her shoulder, grounding her. She looked up at him, at the scar that marked his face, at the quiet strength in his eyes. Hope stirred in her arms, gurgling softly as though sensing the storm had passed. For the first time in her life, Clara had stood against her father. And for the first time, she felt unshackled. The cabin was no longer a punishment, no longer a cage, it was the beginning. She leaned lightly into Jonas's side, the baby warm against her chest, the spring air sweet with new grass. The judge had ridden away furious, but Clara didn't watch the road any longer. Her eyes turned forward, toward the land she now called her own, toward the life she had claimed on her terms. Jonas, silent and steady, remained at her side, and together they stepped back into the cabin where their future waited.